Hi, it's Mr. Anderson, and in this podcast, I'm going to talk about ecological succession. Succession is simply a series of events by which life comes back. And so what am I talking about? Well, look here, we've got a picture of a forest, but this is a year after there was a forest fire. And so you can see a lot of the charred, burnt trunks. And so basically, a photographer came here, and he came here once a year to the same place and took pictures. And so this would be year 1, this would be year 2, this would be year 3, year 4, and year 5. And so basically what you see is life coming back and changes taking place. And that is called succession. And it tends to occur at a predictable rate and using a number of predictable species. And so basically succession we could break into two different parts. The first one is called primary succession. Primary succession occurs when you have bare rock. In other words, when there's no soil left. And so if you look at this lava flow, basically the lava flowed down here. You could see they've kind of cut a footpath here. But basically life is starting to come back. Life can't grow out here for the most part because there's no soil there. We can't have plants that start to grow there. And so we have to have erosion, we have to have wind and rain, and eventually we have soil, and then we can start to have plants come back. Another example of primary succession is right here. This is a picture of Mount St. Helens the day before it exploded. After it exploded, it looked just like this. And so here in Montana, we had about that much ash everywhere. And that just came from the top of this mountain as it exploded. Well, this would be primary succession because there's no soil left. It's all gone. It's in Montana, not in Washington. And so basically life has to reestablish itself. And so this is a picture of Mount St. Helens now, a few years ago. And so this is on this on this rim up here. And so basically what's had to happen, a series of events by which life has come back. Now if you compare this to that Estonian forest, you can see that it's coming back slower. And that's because we had to go all the way down to the rock. Great example of this is the island of Surtsey. And so I think this was in 1962. All of a sudden off the coast of Iceland, there's a huge volcano and a brand new island shows up. They name it Surtsey, which is some Norse god. And so basically what scientists decided to do is to not go there. A few scientists will go there every year just basically to study how life comes back. And so you can see all this vegetation on this island, and there's been weathering going on. You would just think this is just a regular island, and it's really not that old. And so the cool thing is they can see what species are showing up first. It didn't take long for vascular plants to show up, and you might think, how did they get there? Well, a lot of them are blown by the wind or carried by birds or float there. And so it's pretty cool, but all of that again is primary succession. Secondary succession, and this is a gorgeous picture that was taken here in Montana during a forest fire. Secondary succession occurs when we have some kind of a disturbance, but the soil still remains. And actually the burning of fires is something that's really common in the mountains. And so you can see this elk here after the fires in Yellowstone Park, and there's no vegetation. But what you should know is that the soil is sitting there and life is ready to come back. And so basically this is what Yellowstone Park looked like a few years later and then looks like now. And so what were some of the first organisms to come in? Well, we tend to call these things pioneer organisms. And pioneer organisms are going to be organisms that tend to make their living by coming into an area after there's a disturbance. And so two examples in Montana, one would be lupin. Lupin is going to be a flower. It's actually a legume, so it's related to a pea. And what's nice about lupin is that it can fix nitrogen. It has bacteria that live on its roots, and they can actually take nitrogen in the air and return it to the soil. And then another example would be lodgepole pines. Lodgepole pines are really skinny and long conifer trees that we have here in Montana. And basically what they do is they have two different cones. They have certain cones that they use year to year to reproduce, but they also have these really waxy, what are called serotinous cones, and they're just filled with wax, and they never open unless there's a fire. And if there's a fire, then they'll open up and then their seeds will come back. And so basically lodgepole pine have evolved this niche, their way to be a pioneer species, to come in. Now eventually, as that forest starts to develop, it's going to be replaced by more climax species. And so that's another term that I just threw in there. That's called the climax. Climax is basically what's going to happen after succession. So on this side, we'll have a disturbance. So we're going to have a disturbance on this side. So what are some disturbances? We could have fire or human disturbances or like a tsunami. A really cool disturbance is after Chernobyl, the meltdown there, all humans had to leave, and so it's a wild kind of a land. But basically life can come back. And how does it come back? Well, let's look at this chart, which is great. So if we look at bare rock's going to be the first thing that you have, and the amount of bare rock is going to drop off as vegetation, of course, starts to come in. What's next? Well, then we're going to have mosses and grasses come. Why don't they come right away? Well, lots of times there's no soil there. And so we have to have weathering, rain, wind, and then we start to get soil, and then they can come back. Now you might think, well, why don't they just stay forever? Why don't they just have a huge amount of these grasses? Well, if you think about it, as other species start to take off, they're going to be taller than those grasses. They're going to start to take the sunlight, and so they're going to be replaced by other species, which is eventually we're going to have some small wooded plants, and then we're going to have some trees. This would be like the lodgepole pine, and eventually we have some trees that come back like that. And so what happens eventually, everything kind of levels off, and then we have these climax species at the end. Does it stay like that forever? Well, it depends on your size. So if you're like a redwood tree, you're big enough that fire sweeping through an area is not going to affect you. But most species are going to be killed by a disturbance, and then that whole process starts over again. And so what is succession? It's the series of steps by which life comes back. Remember, there's primary no soil, secondary soil, and I hope that's helpful.